Part D under respiration, transport of gases. All about the transport of gases. We need a little background first, and then we'll talk about oxygen transport and carbon dioxide transport. Let's look at net movement. Here is a U-shaped container with a selectively permeable membrane separating two solutions. On the left side of the membrane, the solution has 4,000 particles. On the right side, 2,000 particles. Let's assume these particles are able to cross the membrane in both directions. So a net movement exists. Question: what would eventually happen to the net movement of particles? Well, notice at first you have more moving from left to right, fewer from right to left, so it makes sense that eventually the concentration on both sides would be the same, and there would be no net movement. Now notice the particles are still moving across the membrane, but the movement in both directions is the same. What would happen to the net movement of particles in the figure, right, if you continuously added particles to the left side and removed them from the right side? The answer is a net movement from left to right would continue because a concentration gradient or difference is maintained by adding the particles into the left and by removing them from the right. You'll see shortly why I discuss it in this manner. Before going on, let's look at partial pressure. Partial pressure is the pressure of a gas in a mixture of gases designated PO2 or PCO2. Partial pressure refers to a concentration of gases dissolved in a gas or liquid measured in millimeters of mercury. That is, it's a percentage of the total. Dalton's law states that the total pressure of a mixture of gases is equal to the sum of the pressure of each gas. For example, pressure of air at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury. Air is composed of oxygen. 21% of the air is oxygen, so 21% of 760 is 160 millimeters of mercury. That's the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. 0.04% of air is carbon dioxide. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 0.3 of a millimeter of mercury. It's a little odd that there's so little CO2 in the air and yet it has such a big effect on climate change. 79% of the air is nitrogen, so the partial pressure of nitrogen is 600 millimeters of mercury. Gases will also dissolve in liquids in proportion to the partial pressures. So the partial pressure concept applies to gas or liquid. In the bottom container on the left, it starts with partial pressure of 80 in the air above the liquid, 40 in the liquid. Conversely, the container on the right, the beaker, has a partial pressure of 80 of whatever it is in the liquid and 40 in the air. The gases diffuse until there's an equal concentration in both. Let's look at the gases in the respiratory system. This figure is a review of circulation, indicating arterial and venous blood. You may remember this, but let's summarize. Arterial blood is found in the systemic arteries, such as the aorta, and the pulmonary veins. Venous blood, on the other hand, is found in the systemic veins and the pulmonary arteries. Remember, arterial blood is oxygen-rich blood. Venous blood has given up some oxygen, so it's oxygen-poor blood. Here's a schematic view of the system, the essential components. And we'll talk about the pickup of oxygen and the removal of carbon dioxide using this figure. Here's the alveolus, one of the tiny sacs within the lungs. This represents the circulation. It's, of course, a simplified view of the circulation. You see arterial blood at the top and venous blood at the bottom. And this represents the tissue cells, the cells that require oxygen and release carbon dioxide. The gases in the respiratory system will be represented with a fraction, the PO2 over the PCO2. Atmosphere at sea level, the the oxygen concentration is 160, and the carbon dioxide concentration is 0.3. We've mentioned this. In the alveolus, the concentration of oxygen has decreased to 105, and the concentration of CO2 has increased to 40. That's because the inhaled air is mixing with air already in the respiratory tree. Arterial blood has a concentration of 105 for oxygen and 40 for carbon dioxide. Again, these are the partial pressures. The tissues have an oxygen partial pressure of 40 or less and a carbon dioxide partial pressure of 46 or more. Now, this depends on the activity of the tissue and the need for oxygen. Venous blood, therefore, has a partial pressure of 40 for oxygen and 46 for carbon dioxide. Exhaled air, finally, has a partial pressure of 120 for oxygen and 32 for carbon dioxide. Notice that the exhaled air has a lot of oxygen in it. That's a good thing. Otherwise, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation would do no good. What maintains the concentration difference, that is, the gradient of carbon dioxide between the blood and the alveoli in the lungs? Ventilation removes the excess CO2 to maintain the concentration gradient. This was discussed with the U-shaped container a moment ago. Given that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the capillaries of the lungs is 46 millimeters of mercury, what prevents the carbon dioxide concentration in the alveoli from rising to 46? Well, it's the same answer. Ventilation is removing the excess carbon dioxide, maintaining the concentration gradient. How much oxygen is in the blood? Well, at 105 partial pressure of oxygen, the plasma contains roughly 3 milliliters of oxygen per liter of plasma. All right, that sounds straightforward enough. But cells in general need about 40 milliliters of oxygen per liter. So you see, there's not nearly enough at a partial pressure of 105 to supply the cells with their needs. Whole arterial blood, on the other hand, contains 200 milliliters of oxygen per liter. Where's the rest of the oxygen? Well, it's bound to the hemoglobin. Now, what I'm trying to do is emphasize that the oxygen is found in two places. It's found in the hemoglobin and dissolved in the plasma. Hemoglobin binds oxygen to become oxyhemoglobin. Arterial blood contains 100% oxyhemoglobin. That is, it's 100% saturated. Venous blood, on the other hand, contains what percentage of oxygen? It contains still 75% oxyhemoglobin. The tissues, therefore, have removed 25% of the oxygen. In the coronary circulation, venous blood contains 35% oxyhemoglobin, which means 65% of the oxygen that was bound to hemoglobin has been removed by the cardiac muscle. So it's a very efficient supply of oxygen for the heart. What about the transport of oxygen? Oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood plasma. As it does so, the partial pressure in the plasma increases from 40 millimeters of mercury to 105. As the PO2 reaches the 40 to 60 range, oxygen begins to diffuse from the plasma into the red blood cells, where it binds to hemoglobin. Oxygen is transported to the tissues in the red blood cells and the plasma. Dissolved oxygen, that's the partial pressure of oxygen in the plasma, it diffuses from the plasma to the tissues. As the PO2 drops to the 40 or 60 range, oxygen is released from hemoglobin and it begins to diffuse from the red blood cells into the plasma. It continues diffusing, therefore, from the plasma to the tissues. Question: how does oxygen get from the blood to the tissues? By diffusion. Another question: which oxygen diffuses out of the blood bound to hemoglobin or dissolved in the plasma? That is, which oxygen is it that's diffusing out of the blood? The answer is it's the dissolved plasma, shown as the 105 and 40 in the plasma. The oxygen in the hemoglobin must first be released from the hemoglobin into the plasma, then it diffuses out of the plasma. So, another question: what's the role of hemoglobin in oxygen transport? The answer is it's a container to hold oxygen. It holds most of the oxygen. In summary, 2% of oxygen is transported in the plasma. That's the PO2 of 105. 98% of the oxygen is transported in combination with the hemoglobin. The oxygen that's lost from the blood can be described in an oxygen dissociation curve. It describes the oxygen released from the hemoglobin. Notice the solid line. It compares the PO2 in the plasma with the hemoglobin saturation. That's the amount of hemoglobin bound oxygen. When the plasma PO2 drops to 90, the hemoglobin is still 100% saturated. That is, it has not lost any oxygen. Question: where is the oxygen going when the plasma PO2 drops to 90? Answer: it's diffusing out of the plasma into the cells. When the plasma PO2 drops to 80, the hemoglobin concentration is still 98%. That is, hemoglobin is 98% saturated. It has released 2% of its oxygen. As the PO2 drops to 70, the hemoglobin now is 95% saturated. It has released 5% of its oxygen. When the PO2 drops to 60, the hemoglobin is still 90% saturated. It's released 10% of its oxygen. But when the PO2 drops to 40, the hemoglobin is 75% saturated. It's released 25% of its oxygen. Notice that most of the oxygen that's bound to hemoglobin that is being released is released in the 40 to 60 range. Saturation drops from 90 to 75. 15% of its oxygen has been released. The oxygen dissociation curve can shift to the right. Hemoglobin releases oxygen easier, shown by the dashed line, during increased oxygen demands, so it's released at a higher PO2. Increased oxygen release is triggered by exercise. This is called the Bohr effect, increased temperature, BPG, it's a substance called diphosphoglyseric acid, also called biphosphoglycerate, BPG. The mechanism will be described. Exercise increases oxygen demand. It generates increased carbon dioxide. That in turn generates increased hydrogen ion concentration. That is, it decreases the pH. This will be understood when we get to carbon dioxide transport. It causes the hemoglobin to release oxygen at a higher VO2. Increased temperature. Active tissues generate more heat. That promotes the increase of oxygen, release of oxygen from hemoglobin. BPG is made by red blood cells when oxygen concentration decreases. Temperature rises, hormones act on red blood cells. Thyroxine, for example, epinephrine is another, growth hormone, and testosterone. All of these have an effect of releasing oxygen from hemoglobin. When the plasma PO2 is 80, the hemoglobin is 95% saturated. It has released 5% of its oxygen. When the plasma PO2 drops to 60, the hemoglobin is 75% saturated. That is, it has released 25% of its oxygen. When the plasma PO2 drops to 40, the hemoglobin is now 35% saturated. It has released 65% of its oxygen. Again, most of the oxygen that will be released is released in the 40 to 60 range. Much more is released, though, as indicated by the blue lines. So saturation drops from 75 to 35%. 40% of the oxygen has been released. Before continuing with carbon dioxide transport, let's review acids and bases. Remember, an acid is any substance that releases hydrogen ions. For example, hydrochloric acid ionizes into hydrogen ions and chloride ions. Carbonic acid ionizes into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. In both cases, the quantity of free hydrogen ions in solution has increased. The strength of an acid varies. A strong acid, such as hydrochloric acid, ends up at equilibrium with 1 part of the molecular form, hydrochloric acid, to 20 million parts hydrogen and chloride ions. So for all practical purposes, this reaction is not reversible. A weak acid, on the other hand, such as carbonic acid, ends up producing 1 part of molecular carbonic acid to 20 parts hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions at equilibrium. If we compare that to the strong acid based on 20 million parts, that would amount to 1 million parts of the molecular carbonic acid to 20 million parts of the hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Base accepts hydrogen ions, thus decreasing the concentration of hydrogen ions in solution. For example, sodium hydroxide. It ionizes into sodium ions and hydroxide ions. The hydroxide ions then react with hydrogen ions to form water, thus removing hydrogen ions from solution. The pH scale is a measurement of hydrogen ion concentration. It's a measurement in moles per liter. The greater the hydrogen ion concentration, the lower the pH number. What about bicarbonate? Well, this is quite important in carbon dioxide transport. When carbon dioxide mixes with water, it forms carbonic acid. This is a reversible reaction. Red blood cells contain an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase that increases the rate of the reaction. both forward and backwards. The carbonic acid then ionizes to generate bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Carbon dioxide transport occurs in three ways. Roughly 8% is in solution in the plasma as carbon dioxide. Roughly 11% is in combination with blood proteins. These are called carbamino compounds, mainly hemoglobin. Roughly 81% is in the form of bicarbonates, and that's what we're looking at in the diagram. Carbon dioxide transport in the form of bicarbonates begins with diffusion of carbon dioxide from the cells into the blood plasma. Then the carbon dioxide diffuses into the red blood cells, and the carbon dioxide there reacts with water to form bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Why does the carbon dioxide react mainly in the red blood cells? After all, the plasma contains water. Because the red blood cells contain the enzyme carbonic anhydrase that speeds the reaction. The bicarbonate ions then diffuse from the red blood cells into the plasma, and they're transported in that form to the lungs. In the lungs, bicarbonate ions diffuse into the red blood cells. They combine with hydrogen ions to form water and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide diffuses from the red blood cells into the plasma, and then from there into the alveoli and is exhaled. Let's look at the chloride shift. This is another process that goes on. It's designed to maintain stable concentration of ions. And in effect, the bicarbonate ions, negative ions, are replaced by negative chloride ions. There's a pump. It's an antiport pump that transports bicarbonate through the red blood cell membrane in one direction and pumps chloride in the opposite direction. This serves to maintain the same negative ion concentration in the red blood cells. Hydrogen ions combine with hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin to form those carbamino compounds. The hemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin also serve as buffers, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to the urinary system. Let's look at something called ventilation-perfusion coupling. The blood flow to different parts of the lungs must be matched with the airflow for maximum efficiency. Low oxygen promotes vasodilation in the systemic vessels, but vasoconstriction in the pulmonary vessels. Low oxygen promotes constriction of the bronchioles. The opposite condition in our discussion will be in red. If the airflow to a part of the lung is decreased, PO2 is decreased. Vessels constrict. Blood flow decreases to match the airflow. If the blood flow to a part of the lung is decreased, PO2 is decreased. Bronchioles constrict and airflow decreases to match the blood flow. You're now ready to continue with Part E, control of breathing.